popular demand, I've managed to persuade Stu Michael to come back on our series to talk a bit more about some stuff that we didn't cover on the last chat we did. So thanks, Stu, for making yourself available on this Sunday morning.
Cheers. Thanks, Hannes. Is that I confirm it's a precondition when you do these chats that your guest has to say, guys, can you see me? Am I still looking nice and handsome?
Dear. Stu, look, I want to actually start this talk kind of at the end. Let's go to Lancaster House, because you were there, and it's an ongoing area of great interest to me and a lot of other people. And what we did touch on last time, I think, was the fact that we now know that there was a section within the Rhodesian signals who had managed to crack the British code, and they were intercepting the messages that were being sent from Whitehall, from Carrington into Tanzania, into Dar es Salaam, to keep to the British Embassy, I think. And from there, the British Embassy was informing Julius Nyerere, President Nyerere, as to what was going on and what was expected to happen. Those signals were being intercepted, so one must assume that the Rhodesian or Zimbabwe Rhodesian delegation at Lancaster House would have been informed of the content of those transmissions. And in those, Carrington was basically telling Nyerere that the job is done. The stage is set to transfer power to basically to Mugabe. And in fact, what he was saying was, we've kind of hoodwinked the Muzorewa into believing something that isn't actually going to happen. But Muzorewa took it hook, line, and sinker. And I know from my personal time with Ian Smith that although I don't think he was privy to this information, because by that time I think he'd been sidelined, but he could see very clearly from his previous experience that the Brits were up to their normal tricks. And he warned General Wars very sternly about what he thought was happening and asked him to be on his guard. That warning seems to have fallen on deaf ears, because the rest is history. But I just want to know from you what you gleaned from your interaction with the former Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister then was Muzorewa, but from Mr. Smith during that period of time.
Yeah, Hannes, interesting that before we left Salisbury, we had a superintendent who was coming across with us. And at the last minute, he was changed. He was going to come, and then he suddenly came in and he said, guys, I've been sidelined and I'm being replaced by a senior special branch officer who we didn't know. I actually met him in London. And I often wondered why they would have suddenly made that change, because he was a senior chap. And I guess it may have had something to do with this. At Lancaster House, there was a room set aside as the communication center, which was out of bounds for everybody. There was very few chaps going in and out of it. And there were guys who came from Red Bricks. I'm sure you'll recall Red Bricks, the SB, the CIO rather, headquarters in Harare. These guys came from there, and they set up this comm center in this one of the rooms at the hotel we were staying at. As I say, that was out of bounds for the rest of us. I suspect that that's where the comms were toing and froing from. I can say that Ian Smith oft said on a number of occasions, and he was never derogatory about any of his adversaries, talking about Muzorewa. He always referred to him as the good bishop. And he said on a number of occasions, the good bishop is no match for these other two, referring to Mugabe and Nkomo. He's like putty in their hand. They actually eating him like green mealies. So he was well aware of Muzorewa's position, and that he was being taken for a ride. So he was aware of that, and obviously, as you say, he alerted General Walls. But that's supposition on my part. Obviously, like you, we're assuming that this is what took place.
Stu, how long were you actually there for before? And what actually happened? Was Ian Smith just told he was no longer required? What were the circumstances?
Yeah, I don't think in so many words. Hannes, I think I was there for about 11 weeks, but I'd gone ahead of the delegation, as I mentioned last time. And he arrived, whatever it was, a week, 10 days after that, for the duration of the talks, except for a break when he flew back to Rhodesia to brief, I guess, his colleagues and the electorate. Otherwise, he was there for the whole time. But there were incidents that happened that he wasn't involved in. I think there was an invite to Buckingham Palace, and he was sidelined. We went to the memorial service at Westminster, the Battle of Britain, and he was not allowed to attend officially, and he had to be snuck in through the side door. I mean, very well received by his old colleagues from the Air Force, and he was given, by them anyway, all the VIP treatment. But from a government point of view, and there were members of royal family had come there as well, he was sidelined. I think General Walls went off and had tea with the Queen Mother, and unbeknown to Smith didn't know about that. He found about it later. So in that regard, yes, I suspect that he was sidelined.
Stu, what other politicians did he interact with while you were with him?
Hannes, there weren't many who were at the conference who he reacted with, but there were obviously his friends. I think Julian Amory was one of them. He was a friend of Rhodesia's. The Crawfords, not politicians, but quite well-to-do in the business world and good friends of Rhodesia. And he spent time with them, and a lot of the conservative, perhaps more of the right-wing conservatives, he spent time with. But I don't recall any of the current leaders interacting with him other than at Lancaster House itself, at the talks itself. There was nothing sort of after hours that he had any contact with him. Certainly not that I was aware of, and I think I was with him the whole time there.
Okay, let's go back. You mentioned this most interesting chap by the name of Abrams, who was...
yes, yeah, Frank Abrams, who was a coloured gentleman. And I think our last chat, I mentioned that I wondered what had happened to him. And shortly after our chat, I got a phone call from a mate of mine who had watched the interview, and he said, look, I can help. Frank Abrams, when he left Ian Smith, he moved to David Smith, the former Deputy Prime Minister, and became the David Smith's family personal chauffeur. And I got that from David Smith's son-in-law, Ralph Henderson, who was married to Lizzie Smith. Okay. And then confirmed later by Rob Smith, who chatted to me in an email and said Frank had passed away. David Smith had attended his service, as had Rob Smith, actually.
Tell us a bit about him. He was a man of mixed race, a colored, but obviously
he was. He had served in the Second World War. Served with the Rhodesian forces. Hannes, he really was an absolute gentleman. I don't believe he was ever involved in politics. If he was, he kept it to himself. He was a leader in the Arcadia community, in what was then known as the coloured community. Very well known and very well as well. It was quite well to do in the church.
Stu,
so yeah, a nice chap.
How long did he drive? So he was Ian Smith's driver, and for how long did he?
Certainly before I got there. So he would have been employed by the CMED, the government Central Mechanical Equipment Department. They employed all the government chauffeurs and drivers, and I guess his position was the ministries. And so he was certainly with Ian Smith for as long as I was there, and a few years before. So I'm going 5+ years or so. But certainly the chaps before me, they had knew him as the chauffeur as well. A good fellow.
Yeah, Stu, it's an issue that we need to approach with caution, because I know we're going into controversial territory, but I want to go back to talking about the possible intelligence failures that
yes.
That took place within the security apparatus. And one particular event comes to mind, and that's the Harare fuel farm fire, or the Salisbury fuel depot fire. Yes. Earlier in the series, I talked to Mike Norton, and he was confirming what I had been told by other people, that there was every reason to believe that some sort of attack was going to take place on something strategic, because this information had been gleaned from captured documents. So there was every reason for the security forces to take measures to protect an installation like the fuel depot in the middle of the capital, and yet, for reasons that remain unknown to me, it was virtually unguarded on the night of the attack. And I have spoken to people who haven't been able to provide the evidence to convince me, but there are people out there who have ventured the opinion that this was actually allowed to happen, because it was a way to bring additional pressure on Ian Smith and the politicians of the day to accept a political settlement. And I'm just interested to hear your views on that.
Yeah, Hannes, it's really way out of my area of expertise. And I've probably heard as much as you, so I'm certainly not in a position to comment on the question you've asked, other than what I've read and what I've heard. But certainly from an official point of view, absolutely no idea. I did visit the site immediately after the attack with the Prime Minister, which it was devastating. It really was. And the reports I read afterwards from the other side, and there was a bit of jousting between ZAPU and ZANU as to who was involved, with ZAPU saying it's impossible for ZANU to have been involved. They just weren't equipped or skilled to carry out that sort of operation, and ZANU countering it by saying it was us. I think Joyce Majura was allowed into the meeting, which was had in Chamoy when they were planning these attacks. And I think it was her that suggested that they hit the fuel depot in Salisbury. I think they had another target in mind prior to that. That's what I've read from the other side's account of the event. But as far as any accurate informational facts, Hannes, certainly no, I don't know. I wouldn't be in a position to comment on that.
During the time on your watch, when you were protecting the Prime Minister, did you ever have to respond to any reports that there might be something being planned to assassinate or harm him? Was there anything like that ever?
Not on a single occasion, Hannes. When I was first transferred there, the first thing we had to do was we went to Red Bricks actually, and we went through a bunch of files, photographs of potential agitators, people who could be trouble, just so we would know who they were. But I can honestly say there wasn't a single incident, which has always amazed me, that in a country that was at war, and the first prize for the enemy would have been Ian Smith. And I guess there could have been many opportunities to have a go at him, but there wasn't. You know, in addition to the security he had from the police, I think it's well to remember that members of the public were also acting as security. They were also another pair of eyes around, and you know, being so loyal to him, I think there was help from that area as well. But certainly in my time, no. There may have been a few, you know, reporters pushing and shoving, trying to get a bit closer, but it was minor stuff. There was no serious threats, to my knowledge, or to the knowledge of any of the chaps I worked with. Hey, probably the closest was, we were flying to, I think, Mvukwi's, and then flying on to Centenary. And I think, and perhaps some of the Air Force guys who watch this will be able to correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was an Islander, the aircraft that he was using. And often the young pilots, and I hope they don't get into trouble, the young pilots always used to say to him, "Sir, would you like to fly?" And he used to take over, and he would fly for, you know, 10, 15 minutes or so. Anyway, on this particular journey, Mrs. Smith was accompanying him, and she was wonderful in that she knew the names of who the hosts were going to be. So she would pre-brief him and say, "Ian, when we land there, you are going to meet Mike so-and-so. He's the chairman of the Farmers Committee, and they've got 2 children, so and so and so." She was very good like that. So he was always prepped for that sort of thing. Anyway, he had been looking at the map, following the map, and then looking down at the ground and telling his wife, "This is where we are," etc. And it was quite bumpy. And he was saying to her, "Don't worry, She said, no, we must go down a bit lower. And he said, no, no, no. In the air, it's much better to be higher, because if you get into trouble, there's more time to sort out the problem. Anyway, she was obviously a bit nervous, and it was a bit bumpy, so probably about lunchtime, when the pilot said, sir, would you like to, take the controls? So he said, yeah, and he left the map with me, and he wandered off, and then we were hitting some serious air pockets, and I think Mrs. Smith was digging holes in the seat, and she said to me, Stuart, give the map back to the Prime Minister, give the map back to him. So that was the only danger that I had been in, was maybe the PM at the controls of this plane in some bumpy weather.
Stu, old Rodri Daly used to tell a wonderful story about Ian Smith. Well, a wonderful story in one sense. It wasn't a good time in our history in a way. It was actually after that a decision had been made to declare martial law in the country, and I think Henry Squires was now the Minister of Defense, and they were chairing a meeting, and I think it was on a Sunday, and this meeting ran into trouble because I think General Walls then, for some reason, balked at this idea, because it was going to transfer enormous power to men in the field. Basically, you could make a decision about just about anything, and you would be covered by martial law. So it was to give the security forces almost limitless powers of arrest and whatever. And then at the meeting, it got bogged down, and Ian Smith was now sent for to sort this issue out and decide what they were going to do. And Rodri Daly says he had never seen him so angry, because he'd actually been in his rose garden and he was doing his roses when he was called to attend this meeting, and he was absolutely livid, because this was a time that he loved his roses, and
yes.
And this was not a time for him to deal with all this other stuff. But anyway, they got him there, and he did. But he apparently was not in a good mood, and he wiped the floor with a few of the people in attendance there.
Yeah, I know he was a very principled man, but very honest. And if he thought you needed to say something, then you should say it and not beat around the bush. So I think he was that type of man. So I can quite believe him doing something like that. Yeah, I do, because that was his makeup, his personality. Yeah, but I don't think he would have been rude to anybody. I doubt that, but he would have probably let them know what they had done wrong or what he thought. But I don't know if he had ever been rude to anybody.
No,
that just wasn't in his makeup. Yeah, chatting to you offline earlier, I did mention that when we were in London and midway through the conference, he thought he had better fly back and speak to his chaps. Whilst we were waiting at Heathrow in one of the VIP lounges, an aide came in, one of the British aides from the Foreign Office, I guess, and he said, Mr. Smith, there's a gentleman who would like to see you in the next waiting room. And there was an interleading door. Anyway, this door opened and Harold Wilson walked in. And Harold Wilson said to him, oh, Mr. Smith, my friend. And Smith greeted him likewise. Mr. Wilson, my friend. They shook hands warmly and greeted each other, asked after each other's families and so on. Very, very civilized. And Harold Wilson said, well, Mr. Smith, I'd heard you were here next door, and I thought I'd just pop in to wish you good luck in your next round of talks. Which was, you know, it's a little byline in the history of things, a little pinprick, but it's just a nice little byline of what was going on. And even though it was, Harold was the we hate Harold character, the two of them were very civil to each other, and Wilson was good enough to pop in and say, you know, good morning and good luck.
Yes, I think it's true to say that even his political adversaries, almost across the board, respected him as a man, even if they didn't agree with his political position. I actually remember very clearly, it was during my hunting days, I had a lady client who was very influential in American political circles, and on safari, we were actually just chewing the fat, and she said to me, so if you had a choice, who would you like to meet in Washington? And I think President Bush was the president then. But I said, oh, the guy I'd really like to meet is Henry Kissinger. He interests me. And she said, okay, well, I'll see what I can do. You know, let me know when you're coming to America again. And the following year, I went to America. I was going to the hunting convention in Las Vegas or Reno, I can't remember. But she said, you know, I was invited to stay with her. She's the late Mrs. Susan Brinkley. She was married to David Brinkley, who was then a very famous political commentator on television. And there it was. A dinner party was organized, and I was seated next to Dr. Kissinger. But before I left Zimbabwe, I told Mr. Smith that there was a likelihood that I was going to meet Henry Kissinger. And so he said, well, would I take a letter to him for him? And I said, absolutely. So he wrote the letter, but it was in a sealed envelope, obviously, and just asked me to give it to him. Well, we get there, and I'm now sitting next to Dr. Kissinger, and his wife was at the other side of the table talking to some other guys. But after I was introduced, I said, I've got something for you. And he said, from who? And I said, from Ian Smith. And Dr. Kissinger looked at me in total disbelief. And I took the letter out, and he opened it immediately, and it almost brought him to tears. It was a terribly moving moment. I could see this man emotionally overcome. He then got up very quietly, and he went and showed the letter to his wife, Nancy, who was a lovely, very gracious lady. And my word, she then came over to me and she gave me a hug, and she said, you know, he was one of my heroes, your Prime Minister. She was terribly fond of him. And so was Dr. Kissinger. He said it was a heartbreaking moment for him when he had to pressure Ian Smith into the agreement that they reached, because he said he could see this was a man who loved his country and all its people very dearly, and he only wanted the best for his people, and that was very obvious to Dr. Kissinger, and I think that came through in his dealings with politicians across the board.
Yeah, but I know Smith did say that the politician who was honest with him and straight with him was Kissinger. Was one of the guys who was really honest and straight with him. Didn't have much time for some of the others. I don't think he was a great fan of Carrington's at all.
No,
incidentally, when Carrington came to Zimbabwe, then it was, I suppose, I was moved across for the short period he was there, a week or so, to keep an eye on him. And I went up to Inyanga the one weekend to Troutbeck. No, not Troutbeck, Juliusdale. And he was with Major General John Ackland, who was the monitoring force Supremo. Quite a nice chap, actually. And I went out with him a few times for walks. He liked strolling around up in Inyanka. And I used to wander around with him, talk about all sorts of bits and pieces. At the end of the walk, he said, "Why don't you come back to Britain with me? I'll make you my sergeant major." And I had to say, "I'm sorry, sir, I don't want to be a sergeant major. I want to be an officer." Anyway, he just burst out laughing. But he was quite a nice fellow.
Was this Ackland or Carrington?
No, this was Ackland. Yeah. And I spent a lot of time with the deputy governor, Duff, who came from the intelligence world, MI5, MI6. He was head of one of those. So, yeah, he was very ensconced in the British intelligence network, and obviously being the head of it. I'm pretty sure that's the reason that he was sent across as the deputy governor.
Yes, I can tell you, Ian Smith, of all of them, and he had tough times with all the British politicians he had to deal with. But he did say to me that Carrington was pure evil in his words, and from a man like that strong language.
Absolutely, yeah.
He absolutely despised the man, and he never trusted him. It was a worst case scenario, the arrival on the scene of Carrington. I think anybody else, we might have had a different result, but
yes,
he definitely had an agenda, and sadly he won the day, and the rest is history. But Stu, just a little bit about Ian Smith interacting with black people. You must have seen that on many occasions. And was there any? Did you ever see any animosity or hostility towards him?
Not at all, Hannes. Hannes, he had a great relationship with the traditional leaders in Rhodesia. He was a great fan of that system, and as history knows now, that's kind of where he was coming from. You know, that these communities have already got a system. This is how they operate, and now we're dumping, you know, Western democracy and voting, etc., on them, which is, you know, absolutely foreign to them. But yeah, he was a great fan of them, and they greatly respected him as well. The political leaders, when they had the transitional government, they had guys like Ndabaningi Sithole, James Chikarema, there was Chirao Indoweni, and Muzarewa himself. I think he got on well with them. Of that bunch, I think Sithole was way ahead of the others in ways of the world, really. He was a well-traveled man, a well-educated man. But the two of them were very civil to one another. I don't think there was, certainly don't recall anything untoward between them. There was an occasion when, and I'm not sure why I was asked to do, but James Chikarema, we had a bit of a check at history in Zonu, in the Zonu camp. he'd broken away with him and formed his own party and then came back to that sort of thing. Anyway, he was having a rally. It was at Glam Stadium in Salisbury. And all the uniform branch guys were there. And I don't know how it came about, but I was told I had to go. Anyway, so I went off and sat amongst the crowds. And Chikarema saw me, and he knew where I'd come from. And during the meeting, he said, I'm supported by everybody. Even Ian Smith has sent his own security people to look after me. There he is, pointing at me. Of course, that got picked up in the press. And Ian Smith didn't miss it either, because when I got back with him, he said to me, you know, Stuart, you shouldn't have done that. You know, sir, you know, I was instructed that I was to do it. And he said, well, I was wrong. Because now, and he's quite right, he said now, the others are going to think that I'm aligning myself with Chikarema, which I'm not, which was a point. So that was a blunder on whoever's decision that was. I don't know where that came from. I guess we just didn't question those sort of things. It was yes, sir, and off we went. But otherwise, no, he had a good relationship with him, and he obviously enjoyed Chirao and Ndweni because they were traditional leaders. And to be fair, and not be unfair to them, they were a step or two behind these wise chaps. They really were. They were still steeped in their, you know, in their old traditions, and they really hadn't been brought up to speed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember one of the chaps who was asked to look after Chirao, a chap named Kevin Santosky. Kevin coming back the one day, wide-eyed, and he said, well, I've just been shopping with the chief, and I took some of his stuff back to his house, and he asked me to put the stuff in his cupboard, and I opened his cupboard, and Kevin looked in there, and Kevin said, honestly, when I looked in there, I saw that Chirao had more suits than Jesus had sheep. That's all he had. He just loaded up his cupboard with suits. You know, maybe, you know, he thought, well, I need all this kit for my new position now.
Stu, did you have any interaction with Mugabe or in cammo?
Mugabe, no. But one of the team who was with us, Willie Botha, who had come from Muzarewa. He was attached to Mugabe, but he was really, you know, he was all he was a face. He wasn't involved in anything. He wasn't included in anything. He wasn't told anything. So if Mugabe went anywhere, Willie would find out at the last minute. He wasn't included in any meetings or any debriefs. I can understand that, really. We were from the other side, I guess. And when Soames left, I was left at Government House when Banana came in, and we know all the controversies surrounding him when he was there. So I was there for a couple of months. I think he was an accredited FIFA referee, football referee. And he got his team together at Government House, and they were called State House Tornadoes. And I think they pinched players from Caps United and Dynamos, and actually got into whatever the top league was, the Super League, and they played as State House Tornadoes. I was playing a lot of rugby at the time, and they used to train at the police grounds where we played rugby and trained. And the one particular occasion, the training days clashed. We were all there, the police rugby team, and all these footballers arrived. Anyway, and Banana arrived as well. And he said, okay, let's have a game of football. We'll play the police will play my State House Tornadoes, which we did. Yeah, all racing around playing football in the rugby field. You know, it was quite good humor for us all. But by then I'd put my notice in, and I was soon whisked away from there.
Stu, just going back to Ian Smith and the traditional leaders, you're quite right. He had a very high regard for African customary law and culture. But
Yes.
I think I'm right in saying his maiden speech in the House of Assembly after he, as a young member of Parliament, was actually about the Lobola system. He was very anti it because he felt it was just unfair on the African females who were really being sold into a form of marital slavery, I suppose, and he wanted that interfered with. He was, as a young man, I think, looking for legislation. But I think the district commissioners, the internal affairs guys, got to him and said, no, this is the sort of interference that will only create animosity, and don't tamper with it. And that I think was the end of it. But it was something that troubled him. He didn't like this idea of there being a monetary value put on a woman's.
Yeah, he actually put great store in what was internal affairs. He really did. And in hindsight, I think that's one of the places that we slipped up on is understanding the culture a bit better than we should have. Whereas the internal affair guys who are working in what was then the tribal trust lands understood the system properly. And I don't think we took enough cognizance of that, or anybody did actually. We got a wee bit left behind. Don't believe, in hindsight, that we paid or gave enough cognizance to INTAF, who had, they lived cheek by jowl with the communities in the tribal areas. And I think perhaps we didn't pay enough attention to what they had to say. We may have ignored some of it to our detriment. I don't believe we knew enough about what was going on in the TTLs. I know that INTAF, they tried hard. They brought out that little pamphlet. Do you remember The Man and His Ways, I think it was? To try and get the general public a better understanding of how the system worked in the tribal areas. And I don't know if that really got across to everybody. And I think that would have made a big difference, trying to understand that sort of thing. There was a story related to me by one of the Lutes in RLI who said there had been a report in the Mount Darwin area where a troopie had taken a radio from a kraal. He'd stolen it. And the villager had gone to complain to the DC, who I think at the time, it may have been Jim Latham, to complain that his radio had been stolen. And Jim immediately got hold of whoever the OC at the time was, the RLI OC, and told him. Anyway, the trooper was called in, the radio was recovered. The trooper had to apologize to the villager. And obviously the trooper was disciplined as well. Now, things like that, if they weren't checked and they went on, which I'm sure they probably did, it wouldn't have helped matters. And my point being that if we had paid a bit more attention, maybe things would have been a little bit easier for us, and we wouldn't have been too much aggression from some of the areas anyway.
Yeah, Stu, I actually told, that's a story that I told. That was a contact that I was.
Yeah, was that, okay, I got that from you, yeah.
You know, and you raise an interesting issue, because I can remember, you know, we, as part of our training, INTAF blokes came during our recruits course to talk to us about African customs and how to protocols and how to approach people and to follow, you know, the correct procedures, basically, how to be well mannered, I suppose.
Yes.
And it's all well and good, but you know, then you do see how these things, you know, in a war situation, it's very hard to expect fighting soldiers to be very civil and polite at all times, particularly when it becomes clear that there's collaboration going on between the villagers and the enemy and stuff. And I saw both sides. I think most chaps, certainly in the commando that I was in, did try to do the right thing, but there is a limit when you're under that sort of pressure. And our OC at the time, he was then Major Charlie Orst, was also, you know, he was a third generation Rhodesian, and he was steeped in what Rhodesia was all about, and it was all about empathy between the races. And he was not he was not happy with excessive use of force. Obviously, he was there and wanted to deal with the enemy, but within limits. And it is that fine line.
It's a fine line, absolutely, yeah.
That's hard.
I understand that completely, honest, that, you know, the heat of the moment when things have happened and maybe one of your buddies has been shot or a farmer killed or something like that, that's how you react. Absolutely. I mean, that is war. But, and I understand that, but that aside, there were occasions where perhaps that sort of behavior wasn't needed. I mean, I saw it on occasions as well. And it obviously didn't do us any good.
No.
But I think the INTAF was a fantastic bunch of guys. They really were. They had a bloody hard job. They were civilians in a war situation, really. Trying to do their civil role.
Very tough job. Trying to continue to administer these areas under that sort of pressure. You've got to take your hat off to them. But Stu, just in closing, I just want to mention my sort of abiding memory of old Ian Smith during the height of the Mugabe years, with Mugabe seldom missing an opportunity to hurl abuse at whites and Ian Smith and stuff. I used to visit him quite frequently at his house in Bath Road. And you know, that front gate was never even locked. You could walk through the front gate, through the front door. He didn't lock the door. And there, you know, he would be sitting. And the tea would come. I forget the name of his cook. He was a wonderful bloke who'd been with him. I'm sure you would have known this guy because he'd been...
Solomon? Was it Solomon?
Could have been. Lovely
Solomon.
old bloke. And he was with Ian Smith for, I don't know, most of his life, I think. But I remember Ian Smith saying to me, you know, he's not enjoying going out to the shops anymore. He used to like to get out and about a bit. But he said it's becoming really difficult because he was getting a bit old and frail. And he was saying, you know, that the Africans were so excited to see him, they would come onto him and want to touch him embrace him and stuff.
Yeah.
And he became a little concerned. Somebody was gonna hurt him just accidentally. Just, you know, the question of people. But that was, I think his last communication with Mugabe was actually a challenge to walk through Chitungwiza together. He said, why don't we see who's popular here? But you leave all your security people behind and we'll go for a walk through one of the African townships and let's see who comes out the other end.
Yeah.
I don't think he ever heard from Ian Smith again. I mean,
I'm sure he didn't. Yeah. My last meeting with Ian Smith was in Cape Town. We had gone down to stay with a friend of ours, with Winston Hart, actually. And Winston had arranged a luncheon with Ian Smith, with a lovely lady named Anne Bishop, who looked after Smith when he was in his retirement home, together with his son Rob and sister Jean. So I went around with Rob, the son, to see Ian Smith. Knocked on his door, and he was sitting, looking out at the sea. He was sitting on his balcony, and Rob said to him, "Dad, there's somebody to see you." And he turned around and he saw me walk in, and he didn't recognize me. And he just said, so it's you. I suppose you've come to tell me that you came to Portugal with me, which I hadn't. You know, it was long before I got there. Anyway, I was able to say, no, sir, it wasn't. And anyway, I had a chat about bits and pieces and what I'm doing. And then we all went out for lunch. We took him out for lunch, which was great. I was able to introduce my wife to him, and my brother-in-law was living in Cape Town at the time. So it was great that they were able to meet him, and Rob's wife Jilly were there, and Winston. So yeah, it was a lovely lunch, and able to sit and reminisce. He still had a twinkle in his eye for the ladies.
Yes, yes.
He did. He was a charming chap.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the last time I saw him. Sadly, I was unable to get down to his funeral to have a last beer and say cheers to him. But yeah, he was a good man. He was a good, solid Rhodesian chap. He really was.
He loved talking about sport.
Yeah, he did.
He couldn't get enough of it. And to his great credit, I think one of his last outings was, I actually was involved in organizing it, but it was Schalk Burger Senior, who wanted to do something for him. And unfortunately, I couldn't go to the lunch for some reason, but they, a young Schalk, I think, went and collected him and picked him up at St. James and took him to Schalk's wine farm near Wellington. And Schalk had all his rugby mates around, and he had the absolute time of his life. He just,
he must have.
He had all those old Springboks there, and they just talked rugby. And in the old days when rugby was a different game, really. But he, I think that was actually one of his very last outings, and it couldn't have been to a better venue with better people than old Schalk and his mates.
He would have loved that. I'm sure it would have been great for him. He did. You know, a sad ending really for a great Rhodesian.
Stu, thanks very much for your time. It's been
thank you very much, Hannes.
Great chatting to you, and I hope we've got some stuff down of interest. I think we have. And
great. Thank you. Thanks.